Situated in Staffordshire in the West Midlands, the sprawling 26 square mile area of outstanding natural beauty known as Cannock Chase is made up of dense forest and open heathland. It's quite a picturesque little spot open to the public for you to enjoy scenic walks in nature. But once the sun goes down, you're all of a sudden acutely aware that the atmosphere isn't as warm and inviting as it was just hours ago, because it's widely believed, especially by some in the local area, to be the home of all manner of supernatural beings, with some going as far as to believe that it is actually a portal to another world. And when you hear some of the stories that real life people have experienced on Cannock Chase, maybe you might also start to believe the same. Have I got a story for you? Oh my goodness. Now, I've known about the stories around Cannock Chase for a very long time. I grew up like not a million miles away from it, but when I started looking into this, I was a little in disbelief because we have a star-studded cast of paranormal characters lined up for you today. Everyone who's anyone in the paranormal, they've been seen around here. It's the Marvel Avengers Assemble, but for ghosts, cryptids, and other creatures that exist on the fringe. And I've got into a little bit of a routine in my videos of adding a little bit of skepticism as I'm going through, obviously where skepticism is due, but this, I don't even know what to think. Just enjoy the stories, we'll talk about it afterwards. So just to start off, the Cannock Chase that I'm going to be talking about today is the country park, the woodland and the heathland bit. But Cannock Chase is actually also the name of the entire district that this 26 square mile patch of nature exists in. But even so, 26 square miles, that is still a big area. And I have uncovered a lot of weirdness that is going to be reported just from this area alone. But let's talk a little bit about the land itself, and before it was this place where you could go mountain biking or take a picnic for the day. Because within Cannock Chase, there is what remains of an ancient Iron Age hill fort, and it's thought that the Celtic tribe, the Cornovii, built and then occupied this fort, now known as Castle Ring, up until about 50 AD when it was possibly abandoned, which kind of fits around the time of the Roman invasion. There is a theory that needs mentioning here, and it's that the name Cornovii actually means people of the horn, alluding to their worship of horned deities. But that wouldn't be beyond the realms of imagination for a Celtic tribe anyway. But to take this one step further, some people believe that the Cornovii would participate in ritualistic human sacrifice to appease these horned gods. However, there is no direct evidence of this, it's just been claimed quite a lot online and in books. But fast forwarding a little bit, in 1086, William the Conqueror quite liked what he saw and declared that this land, home to deer, wild boar and wolves, was now his royal hunting forest. Just gonna take that for himself. Although it wasn't as wooded back then as it is now, there was a lot more open space. In 1290, part of this area came under the Bishop of Coventry and Lichfield's control, and that's how it came to become a chase, which at the time meant a forest that was controlled by someone other than the monarch. And the bishop, he built a hunting lodge and turned it into a deer park, and called it Bow Desert, which means beautiful wild place. In 1546 though, following Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries, the church had been relieved of this land, and it had either been given to or sold to one of King Henry's most trusted advisors, a William Paget. For the next few hundred years, the land was used for animal grazing as well as the mining of ironstone. In 1875 though, parts of the chase were used for military training. There was something like 12 camps in this area at this time, but it wasn't until the outbreak of the First World War where the proper camps were set up. The War Office constructed 2 huge camps, some of the largest in the country at the time. Initially, they were just primarily a stopping point between training and the trenches, but they eventually became the training grounds themselves, complete with barracks and even mock trenches so that the soldiers could experience just a fraction, just a tiny smidge of what they were about to face over on the continent. Mock trenches or not, I don't think anything could prepare anyone for what they experienced over there, but that is a rabbit hole to go down another day. The camps were for British soldiers, but also Allied soldiers as well, including the New Zealand Rifle Brigade. But they also had another use too. German prisoners of war were forced to live and work here, and it was officially labelled as a prisoner of war hospital, but it doesn't really look like that was the case, as highlighted in October 1918 when an outbreak of influenza swept through the camps and killed a bunch of soldiers and prisoners. The camps were then used again during World War II, but after 1945, in the years after the end of the war, obviously tensions began to slowly ease, and on the 16th of October 1959, the UK government and the Federal Republic of Germany, they made an agreement that instead instead of having the remains of German soldiers dotted all about the country, basically wherever they died, they should all be reunited and buried together in one place. And the place that was chosen? Cannock Chase. More compassionate for the fallen soldiers, easier for family members to find where their relatives had been buried, and it just seemed like a good idea all round. And so the soldiers who had died all over the country were transported to Cannock Chase. And so now the remains of over 5,000 German and Austrian soldiers are buried in a cemetery in Cannock Chase. There is also another war cemetery as well as several different war memorials dotted about. As though with the history of the military camps here and obviously the imprisonment of German soldiers and now the cemetery, there are areas of the chase that are now a place of solemn remembrance, of quiet contemplation, remembering all of the sacrifices that these soldiers made. But there are other areas of the chase with an even darker history tied to it. Because in the 60s, Cannock Chase was the backdrop of a horrific serial killer. When the bodies of two missing children, 6-year-old Margaret Reynolds and 5-year-old Diana Tift, were discovered on the 12th of January 1966 by a man who was hunting rabbits down a really rarely used track in Cannock Chase. Obviously, an investigation was launched. They'd already suspected that these two abductions were linked because Margaret went missing in September 1965 and Diana in December of that same year. But eventually, all the trails ran cold. They had no leads on who could have done this horrific thing to two innocent girls. But what the police did know is that because this monster hadn't been caught, he was going to strike again. And he did. On the 19th of August 1967, 7-year-old Christine Darby was snatched from near her home in Warsaw. And after a huge manhunt, like they already knew that there was someone out here killing kids, they put all of their resources into this that they could. But Christine's body was found just 3 days later in a different area of the chase. Again, the investigation into this child killer was renewed. They had new leads. They even had witnesses who had seen a grey Austin Cambridge A55 or A60 near where Christine was discovered. But it wasn't until the attempted abduction of 10-year-old Margaret Alton in November 1968 that the real breakthrough came. A man had tried to lure Margaret into his green and white Ford Corsair, and when that had failed, he'd tried to force her, but she'd broken free and ran away. But all the while, 18-year-old housewife Wendy Lane, she was seeing the whole thing play out and made a mental note of the car and its reg, which she then reported to the police. And that led police to the owner of the car, a 39-year-old Raymond Leslie Morris, who had owned a grey Austin A55 the previous year, as it goes. He was put on trial and found guilty of, amongst other things I am not getting into here, but go and look it up if you want to ruin your entire day, the attempted abduction of Margaret Alton and the murder of Christine Darby. He wasn't charged with the murders of Margaret and Diana because there wasn't enough hard evidence linking him to their cases, but it was strongly believed by everyone involved that he had killed them too. He was sentenced to life and died in prison in March 2014, aged 84. And the story of the murders, it really does hang heavy in the air around the chase, with some believing that it may have something to do with the unexplained activity being reported here. And so, here we go. Are you ready? I'm letting you know now that I'm not going to be able to cover all of the stories in this video alone. This is being split up into parts. I don't actually know how many parts just yet, but there are parts, because there is so much that I need to tell you about. To start off, we're going back to the beginning to Castle Ring, the old Iron Age earthworks, because there are some really weird goings on being reported here. There have been reports of both black shadowy figures and white glowing figures seen in the centre of what used to be the fort. Some witnesses have described seeing both a monk, looking very lost and confused, and a weeping girl appear and then disappear near Castle Ring too, as well as the disembodied voices of ancient chanting and singing, with some people even claiming to hear the sounds of metal hammering, which wouldn't have been an unusual sound for Iron Age settlers in this fort. But then there are the really weird reports. Some people have claimed to see weird lights in the sky above Castle Ring, UFOs, and then other people are adamant that there is a fur-covered creature walking on two legs, kind of resembling Bigfoot, wandering the area. But could this Bigfoot-looking creature actually not be a cryptid, but an apparition of something ancient? Because this next story for me is very interesting. It comes from a woman called Pauline Charlesworth, and she was on the chase back in the 1980s and had a super weird experience. She travelled out to Castle Ring on a nice sunny day in July 1986, and she'd taken a picnic and a book, which just sounds like a dreamy afternoon, to be honest, like fair play. She'd placed the blanket down, got all set up, and was engrossed in reading her book. But after about half an hour, she'd noticed that the atmosphere around her had shifted. Birds had stopped singing, wind stopped blowing through the trees, everything was just unnaturally still and silent. She was kind of just looking about her, not super worried, but concern is rising, shall we say, when all of a a sudden, a man came running out of the tree line directly at her. But this man, he looked like he'd been living in the wilderness his entire life. He had long matted hair, a filthy beard, and was covered in furry animal skins. That was what he was wearing. Pauline noticed that his face, she described it as dumpy. Basically, it looked like a prehistoric reconstruction of a face you might see in a museum. The man was also holding what looked to be deer antlers that had been carved down into a pretty serious looking dagger. And by the looks on his face, he was angry. He was shouting at Pauline in some unknown language, and she was just so stunned at what she was seeing. She obviously couldn't understand this man, so she was just there, rooted to the spot, when between 30 and 40 more of these people, similar to the first man, who were dirty, dressed in animal skins, all appeared out of the trees towards her. They were mostly men, but there were some women too. And they were all talking and chanting in this language that Pauline couldn't understand. But then this group of people, they started sitting down around the edges of the ring. The tallest man out of the group started talking at her. Obviously she didn't understand him, but his body language made it clear that she was in the way. Move. So finally she unfroze and quickly moved to the tree line. The group of people then started chanting and swaying, obviously doing a ritual of some kind, when after 15 minutes, Pauline says that the most horrific creature flew into view above the group. It was a humanoid shape with oily, greasy black skin, thin arms and legs, but with huge, leathery wings like a bat. Oh, and its eyes were glowing red as well. It landed in the middle of the circle and stared at all of the prehistoric people around the edge, shrieking this deafening shriek the entire time. A few of the men then pounced on this creature, which fought to get loose, but they tied it with ropes, dragged it into the forest with the rest of the tribe following behind. Before she could even process what had happened, Pauline was left alone again, and slowly she said that the atmosphere finally started to turn quote-unquote normal again. She finally started to hear the birds singing and the wind going through the trees and everything. Obviously that was a pretty traumatic thing to have witnessed, so she just scooped up her picnic and the book and just legged it to her car. It is worth mentioning from that story though that the book she'd taken with her that day was called Mythico Wood, and if you know, you know, but if you don't, it is a book where mythical creatures can come to life via just the imaginations and collective beliefs of people. So was it that she just slipped into an admittedly absolutely terrifying dream, or did Pauline Charlesworth experience a time slip at Castle Ring? We've got the boy back again. You probably heard him just meowing right outside the door, right, while I was talking? Yeah, he does that a lot. But anyway, the German War Cemetery is another place that's definitely worth mentioning here too. People have claimed to see the figures of German soldiers walking between the headstones here, and the disembodied sounds of wails and howling have also been heard. As though these reports that I'm telling you now are definitely your more standard paranormal goings on. But now, we're getting real weird. You could probably make a drinking game out of this video. Take a shot every time Claire says weird. Because it's gonna get weird. Even weirder. That counts as a double shot. But obviously shots of water, because we promote responsible drinking here and I want you to be hydrated, obviously. So these next stories, they seem to be less about where you are and more about what entities, creatures you might encounter. Some of them have specific areas that they're most often seen in, but others have just been reported all over. In 1964, there was a young couple who had just got married, Mildred and Kenneth Wilson, and they'd not long moved to the area. Obviously it's a nice area, loads of brilliant forest walks just on your doorstep, so they made full use of them, going out for walks every day. After a few months though, something super weird and kind of terrifying happened to the couple while they were out on one of these walks. Kenneth claimed that he heard what sounded like an evil woman cackling. Just think any stereotypical witch cackling, kind of like that. But Mildred, she said it sounded unearthly and completely malevolent. But both of them knew it was loud. Whatever was cackling was close. The strangest part? This cackle lasted for 30 seconds. Obviously stopped the couple in their tracks. They're whipping around trying to figure out where this noise is coming from, but they don't see anything. They can't even get a read on what direction this sound is coming from. No matter which way they turned, it always sounded like it was coming from directly behind them. Obviously they legged it out of the forest as fast as they could, and they didn't really talk about what they'd experienced after that and just kind of carried on as normal, kind of ignored it. It looks like they still continue to take walks in the forest though, which, brave. Someone cackling directly at me with seemingly the express intention of scaring the heck out of me. I'm gone, mate. Those forests just aren't for me anymore. But anyway, every time they went for a walk in the forest, they were immediately on edge. Both of them felt like something was most definitely watching them from the forest, even though, again, they didn't admit it to each other. Until it just got too bad and they did. It was just getting too weird. They started discussing it like, are we just working ourselves up into a frenzy here? Did we maybe just hear an animal making a really scary noise? And now it's just playing on our minds and sending our brains into overdrive. So they started talking to their neighbours about it, who'd obviously lived in the area a little longer. No one really had anything to say until they spoke to a guy called Cyril Gardner, who had lived in the area his entire life. He said that the cackling was most definitely what the couple thought it was, and that according to him, it makes total sense why you feel like you're being watched in the forest now. It's because you are. Cyril's mother had told him a story when he was younger about old Maggie, who haunted the chase in search of weak souls. Her backstory was that she was cursed in the 1850s, and now she can't move on to the next plane, the next world, whatever it is that awaits us after we shuffle off this mortal coil, until she quote-unquote collects 50 of these weak souls to break the curse. And so she's still wandering the forest, apparently as an old woman, creeping up on them before terrifying them with her horrible cackling. Somehow this Cyril had estimated that old Maggie would have been halfway towards her soul quota in 1964. I don't know how he'd figured this out, but that was apparently what he said. And so using that logic, if she was cursed in the 1850s and by 1964 she had about the region of 25 souls, she should fill her soul requirements by the 2060s-ish? Around that? Kinda? I don't know. Because apparently old Maggie is still just as hard at work. The couple, Mildred and Kenneth, they seem to be the ones that got away, as they actually moved away to Heath Hayes, not too far away. But it seems that they never went back for one more forest walk just for old time's sake. Can't ever imagine why. But other people have allegedly come into contact with this character, old Maggie. In 1986, two men who were working for the Forestry Commission, so that's the organisation that looks after a lot of the forestry at Cannock Chase, they terrified their boss when both of them ran back into the offices and just burst in the door, and both of these men, white as a ghost, like they looked terrified. Eventually they calmed down enough to tell their employer that they'd been in the area near to the Pie Green Tower when they'd just got this sense of dread. You know when outwardly you can't logically come to a conclusion that anything is wrong, but deep down you just know that something is very wrong. Like goosebumps all up and down your arms, there are no birds singing, you're in danger kind of wrong. Both of these men reported hearing the sounds of muttering, which made them feel uneasy, but they just tried to put it off. Like, it is the forest, there could be people about, you just don't know. A few minutes later though, this dreadful feeling was just getting worse and worse until neither man could hack it any longer. Both of them shouted as loud as they could, just trying to scare the people away, whatever it was that sounded like people that they couldn't see. But it didn't scare whatever it was away. In fact, it brought it closer. A dark shadow emerged from the trees and started chasing them as both men just downed tools and started legging it back to their work van. The shadow was getting closer and closer. One of the guys actually tripped over a tree root and fell over. His mate hadn't seen him fall. He was still laser focused on getting back to the van and to relative safety. Or maybe he just wasn't brave enough to go back and help. I don't know. But this guy, he was just left sitting on the floor alone. He got back up to his feet and he was spinning around trying to find which way the shadow was going to come from, but he couldn't see anything until he heard a twig snap right behind him. He turned round to see the grotesque figure of an old woman. The forestry worker, he described this woman's eyes as some kind of purple colour, and when she opened her mouth, it was full of maggots. He didn't look at her for long before carrying on, sprinting back towards the van, funnily enough. And for those guys, that seems to have been their only run-in with old Maggie. So it sounds like she appears to a lot of people, but her success rate for collecting these souls is quite low. But that doesn't seem to put her off. She's even been spotted by a group of 4 witnesses not too far back in 2022. 4 teenagers were hanging around in the forest near Pie Green one evening, as teenagers do. And it had just gone dark, so it was getting on a bit, but you know, still light enough to find your way. It doesn't really say much about the finer details of their encounter with this entity, but apparently all 4 teenagers saw this old woman and all heard her say out loud, 4 weak souls, delicious. Obviously the teenagers didn't hang around much longer after that and they all managed to get out. And apparently they've been warned by others that it's probably a good idea for all of them to avoid that area of the forest altogether now. And we'll be coming back to the Pie Green area again next week, especially near the tower. That's got some wild stories attached to it. But for now, there's one absolutely terrifying phenomenon that appears to show that even if you do make it back to your vehicle like the forestry workers, you're not completely safe from the paranormal in Cannock Chase. Because there is apparently a shape-shifting hitchhiker. The first reported incident of this entity dates back to at least the 1970s. That was the earliest I could find. And one night, it was late at night, pitch black, hammering it down with rain, and this guy was driving along one of the roads that cuts through the forest. It was just him in his car, he was all alone, and he saw this young girl. girl. He said that she couldn't have been older than about 15 and she was walking along the grass verge. Bearing in mind it was the 70s, it was a different time, all this driver saw was a young girl walking along a pretty sketchy road in bad weather late at night. So he was a good Samaritan. He pulled over and asked the girl if she needed a lift anywhere. She seemed a bit hesitant, but eventually she accepted and got into the front passenger seat. The driver asked where she was going and the girl responded, "I'm going to the train station to meet my mum." "Okay, no problemo, I can take you there, but why are you out here walking alone at night on this road?" She didn't respond. He just glanced over to her and he noticed that she was just sat there, completely motionless. Like, unnaturally motionless. Not moving at all, not fidgeting uncomfortably about finding yourself in a social situation with a stranger, nothing. The driver just looked back at the road and tried to coax a little bit more conversation out of her. Maybe she thought I was chastising her for walking on the road. Let's just try again. So he asked the girl's name, but instead of responding, a deep, unnatural sounded cackle came from that passenger seat. Clearly this was not the sound that a 15-year-old girl would make. It sounded absolutely terrifying, so obviously he looked over again, but the girl wasn't there. Sitting in this man's front passenger seat was an old man. He had glowing orange eyes, crooked yellow teeth, and was breathing really heavy, laboured breaths. Not okay. The driver slammed his brakes on, the car screeched to a halt, and he looked back over at the old man, thoughts already racing around his head of just what, why, how, who was this man? How had the girl transformed into him? What is going on right now? But once he looked back over, there was nothing there. He was once again completely alone in his car. I don't even know how you carry on after that. How do you convince yourself that you just fell asleep at the wheel and had the most terrifying, almost awake dream? Or do you actually tell yourself that it really did happen? Because that story is far from the only one like it. The author Lee Brickley, who's written a bunch of books all about the weird goings on in Cannock Chase, he had his own experience with this shape-shifting hitchhiker. It wasn't actually him that picked up the entity, but still this story, I feel like it's the very definition of the truth is stranger than fiction, you know? And so Lee used to work the night shift for a food distribution company, but obviously working nights, he'd finish his shift before the first bus of the morning. So if he couldn't catch a lift off a friend or whatever, the only way for him to get home would be to walk alone along one of these roads that cut through Cannock Chase Forest. One night as he was making this trip, a man pulled over and offered him a ride, which, yeah, thank you very much, that's much better than walking along this road. And this turned into a regular thing. The driver was going the same way as Lee, so he ended up just giving Lee a lift home whenever he saw him to save him walking. The driver was really nice, they chatted quite a bit, and Lee found out that this was just something that the guy did. He was just a nice guy. If he saw people walking alone, he'd offer to give them a lift. One morning though, the driver pulled over to pick up Lee, but he just seemed different, a bit off. Lee was a bit like, "Are you okay? You don't seem quite yourself." The driver went on to say that he'd just had the weirdest experience of his life. As he was driving along, he'd seen a woman standing by the side of the road, just staring blankly ahead. She looked like she was in shock, completely catatonic. The driver said she looked to be about 25 years old, wearing a blue cardigan and black jeans. He'd pulled over, clearly the woman looked to have just been through something, maybe she just had an accident or something and that's why she was in shock, so he offered her a lift. She didn't say anything, but she just nodded and got into the back seat of the car. The driver tried to make a bit of conversation, see if she was okay, find out where she was going, who she even was, but she never said a word. After getting no response to any of his questions, he glanced in the rearview mirror and made eye contact with, in his words, an ugly, evil-looking hag of an old woman with sagging, dirty skin and yellow-stained teeth. She was also now dressed in rags. She grinned at him with this evil-looking grin. So obviously the driver, again similar to the last story, slammed on the brakes and turned around in the driver's seat to look at her properly, but she was already gone. The driver had just regaled this quite frankly unbelievable story to Lee. He was clearly very shaken by what he'd experienced. After Lee had calmed this guy down, the driver had taken Lee home, they parted ways as usual, and that was it for a few weeks. Lee was able to get a lift with his friends, so he didn't see the driver for a while, but he hoped that he was doing okay. Like, that's quite a wild thing to have gone through. When Lee found himself having to walk home again, a couple of times he saw the driver's car speed past him. No eye contact, no slowing down, this guy was just gone. Not too much longer after that though, one night, the car did slow down and stop, but he didn't let Lee into the car. Lee went to the driver's side window and just asked what happened, you've got that look on your face again. The driver said that he had seen the woman again. Obviously he didn't stop, he wasn't about to go through that trauma again, but he watched another driver pick up this hitchhiker. And this was between like 2006, 2009 when Lee had this job. It wasn't decades ago, it wasn't in the 70s when everyone loved hitchhiking. Even back then, I don't think I have ever seen a single hitchhiker or heard of anyone offering a hitchhiker a lift. But anyway, that's besides the point. Someone else picked up this woman and so he followed the car, expecting to see the lady disappear in the back seat. But it didn't quite happen like that. The lady did vanish, but so too did the driver, and the car just completely disappeared into thin air. So he was very rattled after that. And he'd said to Lee that he wasn't picking up hitchhikers anymore after that, hence the speeding past him for the past couple of weeks. And not even now, as he'd pulled over to tell Lee about this second experience, he still didn't want to let any stranger into his car anymore, which Lee totally understood. Makes sense why he'd want to just commute alone from now on. But to have not one, but two encounters with this same entity, that is super weird. Who was that other car as well? The one that disappeared? Lots of questions being thrown up there. Those aren't the only specific entities though. And the ones I'm talking about today, they're just your quote unquote standard ghosts. Still weird, but like what I'd usually talk about on this channel. And don't worry, because we are far from done. The first Marquess of Anglesey, a Henry William Paget, his ghost has apparently been seen riding on his shooting pony through the forest, sometimes being accompanied by a pack of hounds. Which, this story, it tracks with what we know about him. Bow Desert, you remember the land that was given to the Paget family by King Henry VIII when they turned it into their family home? This was where Henry William Paget lived, and apparently Cannock Chase was one of his favourite hunting grounds. He seems to be very much a residual haunting, just an echo of a good time in Henry's life, maybe. Much like the reports of an old man wearing a wide-brimmed hat and walking with a cane through the forest. We don't know a great deal about him, but he is thought to be a former gamekeeper. There are also reports of a cyclist riding an old-fashioned bike along the road in broad daylight, who will eventually disappear into thin air right in front of your eyes. Apparently, this one is pretty wild. There have been some witnesses claiming to see a ghostly parachutist. So obviously that would have been from back when it was an important military area. But the stories don't actually go into whether he's actually falling and just never hits the ground, or whether he's just stuck hanging in midair off a tree or something. But that would definitely be an image that would stick with you for a while. You're gonna know there's something definitely not quite right there, aren't you, if you see that? Like, clearly there's not someone living there that requires assistance, especially when he disappears right in front of your eyes again. But then there is one female apparition that seems to be slightly more like an intelligent haunting, seemingly interacting with the living, and she actually has a name. She's known as the Lady of the Chase. She apparently usually manifests near that Pie Green Tower area again, just like old Maggie, but the stories around this particular entity are a little bit different, so you'll know which one you're interacting with. She appears to both drivers along the roads and people just walking through the forest. And if you see her, you will be absolutely paralysed to the spot. You won't be able to move a muscle, not able to walk, look away, nothing. Once you lock eyes with her, that's it, you're trapped. She will stare into your eyes for apparently several minutes before vanishing into thin air and releasing you from the state of terror that has you frozen to that spot. And if all that doesn't put you off ever setting foot in Cannock Chase, I am still not done. There was a story of a group of teenagers who had gone out camping in the forest one night, and for some reason they were recording their conversations for fun. Nothing major, just for some unknown reason they had a recorder and they were taping their evening. The morning after, they again, for some reason, decided to listen back to the conversations from last night. Halfway through the recording though, they heard the most ear-splitting, blood-curdling, bone-chilling, someone's getting murdered over there scream. But none of the teenagers react, they just carry on their conversation as normal. It was so loud and as clear as day. There is no way that they wouldn't have heard it if it had actually happened. So obviously now they're very weirded out, and that counts as a shot, by the way. There must have been an explanation, so they decided to go and have a look around the area that they're camped in, see if they can pick up any clues as to what this scream might have been. In multiple sites around where they had camped for the night, they found areas of the forest where stones had been arranged in circles and twig arrangements had been hung in trees. And I know what you're thinking, because I thought the same. Okay, maybe there's another group of teenagers trying to creep someone out. They've all seen the Blair Witch Project, and by the description, that seems to be what these areas look like, with the creepy looking twigs hanging in the trees. But you gotta remember, but this is an important detail, the Blair Witch Project came out in 1999. These teenagers were out there camping in 1997, 2 years before the film was released. And that still doesn't explain what the scream was on the voice recorder that none of the group reacted to at the time. Weird. Unfortunately, I only read about that story. I didn't come across anywhere that had the uploaded recording. That's all I have. Like, that would have been really cool if someone had uploaded the actual recording, if they still even have it. But even so, creepy story. And it seems like you talk to any local who's from the area or knows Cannock Chase well, everyone has a story to tell. There is something going on in those woods. Regardless of what it is, there does seem to be something. Overwhelmingly, even if people haven't picked up a phantom hitchhiker or been transported back to ancient prehistoric times, so many people will say exactly the same. There's something to that forest. Sure, in the day, it's not too bad. If the sun's shining, it's fine, but can sometimes be awful eerie. Because there's almost like a watchfulness about the place. Like you're never actually alone. And that's made especially disturbing when the silence settles in. You find yourself in the middle of the woods with no wildlife, no birdsong, no wind in the trees. It's just you and whatever else is out there. But I want to know, what do you think so far? What is going on at Cannock Chase? Why is this a hotspot for seemingly every possible imaginable type of paranormal activity? Is it a portal to another world like some people believe it to be? Or is it all just something in the water and people are jumping on the bandwagon claiming to have their own experience? I've not been to Cannock Chase for a long time. I remember we used to go reasonably regularly when we were younger. There was one time that sticks out to me, and when I mean we were younger, we were young. Like, I couldn't have been older than 6, 8 at the time. And we'd gone to one area of the forest, and the Forestry Commission had clearly been doing some work out there. There was like some logs piled up, and me and my brother, we were just playing on the tracks, running between the trees. Our parents were off walking, like not too far away. But even back then, I do remember thinking in the back of my mind, this doesn't feel super right. I think I was too young to actually understand much of anything, but I do remember being somewhat unsettled. It might have been because I felt like we were the only people for miles, like we were completely alone. Or it might have been because there was like so much vegetation that had like fallen off the trees and died that like the sound was completely dampened. So it did give that very eerie, silent feeling. But I don't know, that is all I have to add to the conversation from my own personal experience, not really much of anything. But I can 100% see why so many people have reported these experiences, because even back then, it just didn't feel like a super comfortable place to find yourself, especially alone. But is it paranormal, or is it just people's overactive imaginations? That's hard to say, especially with the sheer scale of stories coming out of the area. But don't worry, we are not done. I didn't even get on to the most famous, allegedly paranormal phenomena of Cannock Chase. You've got all the absolutely deeply unsettling stories of black-eyed children to look forward to next week, plus a whole cast of other characters I cannot wait to introduce you to. So if you enjoyed this video, please do hit the like button, and if you'd like to hear more weirdness just like this, then please do subscribe. But anyway, that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more about the morbid, mysterious and macabre. So until next time, sleep safe. Here he is. I'm not gonna let you in. Okay, I'm letting you in. The boy is in. Let's see how long this lasts.